All the other species of Homo were gatherers. And gathering can take place in a number of different ways. The simplest kind is simply sneaking up on a prey and grabbing it. Then they may or may not transform it. There are other ways of gathering prey. There's organized hunting. And some of the animals, some of the carnivores, hunt in packs. This is true of lions and a lot of the dogs. Wolves, coyotes, these are pack animals. And in order to work as packs, there has to be a certain amount of coordination and communication. So you have the elaboration of calls, particularly in wolves and coyotes. Other big cats do not hunt collectively. For instance, tigers are really quite different from lions. Lions live out in the open savanna country, and they hunt in groups. Tigers live in the forest and tend to be solitary. The small predators usually do their hunting in a solitary way. Ferrets, mink, weasels. So there's a whole array of predators that gather their food in different styles. Now, if the style of gathering food is different, then natural selection acts on the anatomy in ways that will be different. And lately, the functional anatomists have been studying such things as the anatomy of the foot. The reason for this is that the impact of locomotion is spread over the foot in different ways, depending upon foot anatomy. In particular, is the anatomy of the foot adapted for long-distance running or for springing and pouncing? The mechanics of the impact will be different. And so they're attempting to find out a lot about the way of life of our ancestors by studying how they gathered their food. It seems as if primitive humans gathered food by running them down. That is, they would isolate an animal from a herd, run after it until it gets tired. And once the animal is exhausted, then they can close in and pounce. And the animals which will be most exhausted are either the aged or the ill or the very young. So there's this kind of selective activity. The anatomy of the sensory system will also be important in figuring out the way of life of an animal. For instance, if you look at herbivores, one of the problems of the herbivore is, are there predators around? So you generally have the eyes of an herbivore on opposite sides of the head. One eye is enough to be able to detect a lion. And so the eyes of herbivores are spread out over 180 degrees or more in order to be able to detect potential enemies. Now, what you do about a potential enemy is a different question. Obviously, you could run away. The trouble is that there are a lot of enemies, and it would not be very adaptive to spend all your time running away. And so it is that the prey organisms have some kinds of screening systems where they determine, is something close enough to be dangerous and therefore worth hiding. Among prairie dogs, you have a different system where you have scout organisms. Among birds, the different kinds of calls are indicators of danger or friends. Now, the way in which animals detect where the source of an enemy is by the fact that the two ears are separate. There's a certain distance between the ears, And that distance is enough to influence the arrival of sound from different quarters. The intensity of sound and the moment of arrival of sound can be studied mathematically. It lies on a hyperbola, and so you can detect in which direction is the sound coming from. And so the study of the senses of organisms is an important way of understanding their way of life. Now, one question which came up early is, why do the mammals of a desert have big ears?
Regulate heat.
Hmm?
To regulate heat.
Yes, that's an important conclusion, because we think of ears as organs of hearing. And, but in fact, with furry animals, there's not very much skin available for radiating heat. The two areas that have a lot of vascularization without protection are the ears, and in male animals, the scrotum. So I was able to watch a herd of giraffes in East Africa with binoculars and find that the scrota was simply covered with ticks. Now, if predators like ticks are going to go to the highly vascularized tissue, that's not the end of the story. What can animals do about it? And one answer is they can twitch. So the musculature of the ear is, in most mammals, quite different from ours. It's quite a novelty when a kid is able to wiggle its ears. But among the horses and among other mammals that are prey, the wriggling of the ears, the twitching, is a way of driving off flies. So don't be misled by the names of things. Ask the question, what good might it do for the organism? After all, there's no reason why something in the desert should be listening harder than something in the forest. But there is a good reason for it to dissipate heat more. The tongue is another organ for heat dissipation. And so panting is one of the behaviors that mammals use for getting rid of heat. But getting rid of heat is a serious problem. It can lead to exhaustion. And the evolution of mammals has included the evolution of fur and of body size. One of the early laws of ecology was that within a group of similar mammals, the cold climates will tend to have the bigger ones. And the reason for this is that there is more heat generated in a large animal than a small one. It's losing heat through the surface, but generating heat through its volume. So therefore, its heat balance would be better. Whereas very small things like mice have greater difficulty in their management of heat, and therefore they also have to eat more frequently. And this is true of very small birds. Hummingbirds will have to eat about once an hour. They're small, they have a high body temperature, they're losing a relatively large proportion of their body weight per hour. So these are some of the ways in which we examine the evolution of the anatomy of organisms. And this is important also in human evolution, human anatomy. The skull size is one of the things that's been important historically. And in the early work, it was assumed that the bigger the skull, the smarter you are. And this is a rule which generally applies to other hominids, where the skulls are relatively small. And we have skulls of about 1,500 cc. Lucy had about 500. So you assume there was a lot less brain there. Now, one of the things we have to consider is what does an animal do with its brain? It's not obvious that it sits upon the ground and philosophizes. Animals can use their brains for locomotion, for detecting signals, for communicating. It seems as if the relatively large size of marine mammals is related to their very complex communication systems and the fact that they have to orient in 3 dimensions, whereas most of our orientation is done in 2. Well, sometime around 10,000 years ago, people began cultivating crops. Before that time, they used vegetable matter. They would gather seeds, they can gather nuts, they gather fruit, and modern anthropologists have discovered that tribal and pre-class societies eat a great deal of diversity of foods. In fact, somebody did a nutritional study of children in a particular tribal group in Kenya, and they questioned them, what did you have for breakfast and what did you have for lunch? And they tabulated the list, and they ran it through their computers, and they discovered that all of these kids must be dead. So they explored further, and they discovered that on the way to school, the children would step off the path and eat fruits that don't even have names in English. They would eat nuts. They might eat the insect larvae that are in the fruit. And all of these things, they didn't bother telling the anthropologists. Just, oh, you wouldn't be interested in that. Or we don't have a word for it in your language. So the early gatherers gathered very large range of foods. Furthermore, without farming, they helped them. For instance, along the path from the village to the cultivated field, people would eat fruit that they gathered and toss the pits away. They would toss the seeds. And therefore they would be propagating crops which were not being cultivated. So there are many peoples who do semi-agriculture in that way. The Shoshone of the Great Basin lived on acorns. And they had quite a technology for gathering the acorns and pounding them and soaking them and baking them. So this is not really agriculture because they didn't plant them. Nevertheless, they would divert streams of water to direct them where the acorns are going to fall, near the oak trees. So they're irrigating without farming. The Apache, coming down the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains, would sometimes engage in farming and sometimes engage in hunting. And for them it wasn't a big deal. They didn't describe themselves as hunters or agriculturists. These were simply different things you do to get food. It's quite striking that agriculture begins roughly in the same period in human evolution. Now remember, we've been around in the broad sense for about 1 million years. Modern humans spread out of Africa for 50 to 100,000 years. And within a relatively short time we get the beginnings of agriculture, something like 10 or 12,000 years ago. And we have centers of origins of agriculture as developed by the Russian plant geographer Vavilov. And he decided that the place where a species has the greatest number of living relatives is likely to be the place of origin. And so Mexico would be the origin of corn. You have relatives there. The wheats come from the Middle East. You have different chromosome species related to wheat. The rices in Eastern Asia. Central Asia, you have apples. In Kazakhstan, there are forests that are dominated by apple trees. In Ethiopia, you have grasses that are related to wheat, tes. And this was integrated into a system of planting crops and raising animals, where the nomadic herders would come into the fields after the crops had been harvested. They'd be allowed to eat the straw, their animals would, and in return the farmers would gather the manure from the livestock. So this is one of many different forms in which livestock is integrated with agriculture, depending on the terrain. New Guinea independently invented agriculture about 12,000 years ago. In the period after the Second World War, you began to get military flights over New Guinea, and they discovered valleys that looked like gardens among the foray people and other people. These were horticulturists. People would own palm trees, sago palm, and they would harvest them. They grew yams in their gardens. The yams could be eaten, but the yams would also be fed to pigs. And some of the classical work of anthropology is work on pigs in Melanesia, and later on also in Polynesia. Now, pigs are a very good animal, first of all, because unlike cattle, they're forest animals. As forest animals, they're capable of gathering a lot of their own food. There's the famous use of pigs to excavate for truffles in Italy. So people would harvest their yams, feed them to the pigs. The advantage of pigs is that they're better storage devices than yams. You cannot store yams very well for long periods of time because they're invaded by fungus. So the Melanesians did not have giant warehouses of yams. So what they would do is that when they had a big accumulation of yams, they'd give it to the pigs, and when there was a big accumulation of pigs, they'd throw a party. Now, we think of the party as a way of enjoying yourself, as partying, and I'm sure that they enjoyed themselves, but it also had different significance, and that is that there was a lot of prestige attached to throwing these parties. So people would accumulate prestige by turning yams into pigs into partying. You could also grow bananas. Banana is an Indonesian, Melanesian plant. Banana is, at least the cultivated bananas, are triploids. Have you ever wondered why it is that bananas don't have seeds? You don't have trouble eating a banana because of seeds. What you see are the tiny little brown specks, which are aborted seeds. And the reason they're aborted is that the banana has 3 sets of chromosomes rather than 2. So when the chromosomes come together and meiosis and then come apart, they would produce all kinds of anomalies, except for the fact that the banana doubled the number of chromosomes. So it's a hexaploid, and now it's able to divide chromosomes properly, but they reproduce asexually, parthenogenetically. And as a result of this, you don't get a rapid evolution of different varieties. You do get local strains of bananas. And if you find a strain of banana that's different, you can take cuttings of it and propagate it, and it will more or less breed true. Has anybody here ever seen bananas in the wild? Yeah, I think. The banana is not a tree. It's a plant related to lilies and heliconia and such things. The banana plant is a single, very succulent stalk. It has a resin in it that's really sticky. And one of the phrases that we use to say that somebody is really indigenous to our neighborhood is to say that they have the stain of the banana on their hands. Mancha de plátano. Because of the fact that it's polyploid, when mutations occur, they're preserved. So you have a very large number of varieties of bananas, and different communities in New Guinea would have their own local varieties of bananas. So there are bananas, there are sago palm, there are other kinds of palm, there are the varieties of yams. Yams have lots of varieties too. In general, when you have village level economies, there's a lot of local variation in the genotypes of the crops. People would have their own local yams and sweet potatoes. By the way, sweet potatoes and yams are not the same thing. Sweet potatoes are very similar to ornamental plants. Yams belong to a very different family. And both of them are widespread in the world. And when the Polynesians began migrating out into the Pacific, they took yams with them. The migrations of the Polynesians were not accidental shipwrecks for the most part. These were deliberate voyages of exploration, looking for new places to settle. And they did it in these enormous long canoes. They would have a large number of canoers. They would have room for chickens, yams, seeds of other things. And it's because of this that anthropologists have been tracing the migration patterns of the Polynesian peoples. So we have centers of origin in different parts of the world of agricultural crops. The Amazon has a center of origin of cassava. North America, the blueberry is one of the few indigenous crops of the Northeast. The sunflower is another one, coming from the prairie kind of habitat. And the sunflower is used both as a source of protein and for oil. People spread their crops. They carried them, not necessarily by trade, but by migration. And it's interesting to calculate how long will it take people to get from one place to another. You know, people entered, the general view now is that people entered the Americas by way of Alaska, by way of the Bering Strait. There are some alternative theories. They may have migrated down along the Pacific. And there is now underwater archaeology that's been excavating underwater sites and finding residues of human activity. So they look for human artifacts. Thor Heyerdahl had the belief that that the Americans came from Polynesia. The reason for it is, first of all, that the Olmec statues, these very large heads that you find in western Mexico, look somewhat Asian in facial characteristics. They found mummies in Peru, which also may look Asian. So people sprang the theory that agriculture may have been introduced into the Americas. We also know that people have been migrating eastward. That Taiwan, in particular, seems to have been the center of origin of a lot of the peoples of the Pacific, by way of Indonesia first, and then moving east. And these are the non-Han Taiwanese. They have different language, somewhat different physical features. They're the indigenous people of Taiwan, and they're beginning to express themselves politically at the present time. There was a second wave of migration to Taiwan coming from mainland China. And these are people who are similar to the Han people in language and in physical makeup. Nevertheless, they developed enough of a local culture so that when the third invasion came, the Kuomintang, fleeing from the Chinese Revolution, they were received as invaders. And so there are political struggles that take place in Taiwan that reflect different histories of migration. From Taiwan, people migrated to Indonesia and later Polynesia. From Indonesia, you had peoples developing in Borneo, and it's from Borneo that they migrated to Madagascar, the Malagasy peoples. So people carry their agricultural innovations with them. In some parts of the world, you can cultivate crops all year round. It's warm enough, but it may be too dry. And the Middle East is interesting archaeologically because of the fine structure of the ecology. By fine structure, I mean that different habitats are interspersed with each other over short distances. You get nice moist valleys, and you get dry hill slopes. So unlike, so let's say in Central Asia, where there'll be agricultural peoples and there'll be nomadic stock breeders, or Siberia, where the reindeer breeders do not engage in agriculture. Or further east in Mongolia, where the Mongols were primarily interested in good grazing land. Genghis Khan invaded China. Kublai Khan was already 3 generations later. By his time, Mongol culture was being dropped. Now we know that nomadic peoples tend to have a very high status attached to horsemanship. There'll be the annual, essentially rodeo competitions among the Kazakhs of Western China, among Mongols, some of the Tibetans in the plains. In China, the status of being nomadic was sort of analogous to the status of being a Texan. Most Texans are urbans. Most of them never rode a horse, and so on. But there's still a kind of Texan culture. This was the case in the early Mongol dynasties in China. And in fact, there was a debate that went on within the Chinese court as to whether agriculture should be removed completely from China and everything turned into grazing land. It didn't work because people were already 3 steps away from being herdsmen. Among the Chukchi, reindeer moss is the limiting factor. And when a herd develops, it can get too big for the reindeer moss. Even without getting too big, you have to move on. They use up the reindeer moss. But a herd has to be an optimum size. One of the problems is that if the herd is too big, it uses up the moss. And you have to move on much too frequently. And in the course of the migrations, they lose animals. On the other hand, if a herd is too small, they fraternize with the wild reindeer, and you get a lot of defections. So the Chukchi have to have an optimum size of reindeer, and when the herd gets big, the owner of the herd will divide it among sons, and will still exercise a certain amount of influence or